Whenever you look into sci-fi media, one of the most recognizable tropes is that of time travel. When it comes to television, a prime example that always comes to mind is Doctor Who. And I'm sure everyone has heard at least one joke about traveling back in time to prevent Hitler from causing the Second World War. However, whenever I think about time travel, especially video games, there is one person in specific that comes to my mind. Junko Kawano. Having only worked as a planner and designer at Konami until the PlayStation 2 era, 2001 would see her directorial debut in the form of Shadow of Memories. A game about a man named Ike trying to prevent his own death in a town inhabited by very ugly Germans. And also a femboy Charles Martinet. Despite its overall favorable reception, the game was still incredibly niche, and Kawano returned to work as a writer and producer for the Suikoden series, until she was able to make a spiritual successor to Shadow in the form of 2008's Time Hollow. Much like its spiritual predecessor, Time Hollow is a game about changing the past in a myriad of ways to affect the future. While in Shadow, you were trying to prevent your own death while slowly uncovering the reason behind your dying over and over, Time Hollow instead puts the focus entirely on the mystery aspects of its story. On the gameplay side of things, a lot had to be simplified, due to the game now being on a handheld rather than on a console, which is why the somewhat open world structure of Shadow was replaced in favor of a much simpler visual novel aesthetic. I've seen a lot of people complain about the new art style for being too anime, though I honestly find it to be quite fitting for the more light-hearted tone of the game, which isn't to say it doesn't have dark moments, because death is still very much a prominent aspect of the story, though I still find the visuals to be quite easy on the eyes. As for the actual gameplay itself, you draw circles to open holes through very specific moments in the past. You can interact with these holes by examining things, using items, and sometimes talking to people as well. It's not exactly the deepest system, but it really doesn't need to be. Hell, the game is barely 2 hours long. The real meat of the gameplay comes from looking for clues and talking to people, because you can't just open a hole whenever you feel like it. After each timeline manipulation, the protagonist, Ethan, will get flashbacks to events that played out in this timeline. After finding out exactly where, when, and how they happened by talking to all the people involved, you can then proceed to open up a hole there. And that's all there really is to say about the gameplay. Time Hollow opens up with the protagonist, Ethan Kairos, lamenting how his cat Socks scratched him while he tried to give them a bath. After his mother calls him for dinner, it becomes immediately obvious that Timothy, Ethan's father, is quite worried about something, but wishes to wait until the next day to talk to Ethan about it, as that is when he turns 17. After a while, we then get the single best vocal performance Johnny and Bosch has ever done.
Where are you? Mommy, where? Dad?
There's just something really weird about listening to a grown-ass man saying, "Mommy, Daddy," but that's beside the point. After the cutscene, Ethan wakes up to find his room has changed in almost every way, as well as seeing that Socks suddenly has a weird pen stuck to his collar. Though the gigantic hole in the middle of the room doesn't really seem to bother him at first. After a while, it turns out that he actually lives with his uncle now, and that his parents disappeared 12 years ago. And that's where the overarching goal for the game lies, discovering what happened to Timothy and Pamela, Ethan's parents. I personally really like the cast in this game, especially Uncle Derek, and also Morris. The game also really likes to remind you that it's about time travel, so the characters all have last names relating to time, like Toombly or Niner. Very creative, I know. Now, the way I described the gameplay and story earlier may have made it seem as if the game was linear, and to some extent it very much is. However, there are several small details that can and will be changed, and endings to be seen. The very first example of these can be found right on day 1, where one of Ethan's friends has gone missing 3 days ago, and your goal is to prevent her from ever going missing in the first place. After finding all the clues, you have then the option to change the past at 2 different places. Once inside the school, at the lockers, and once in front of the Café Kronos. Depending on where you decide to place the plot-relevant item, several minor things in the story will be permanently changed during your playthrough and later playthroughs. And while they seem negligible at first, they are actually quite important to how you will be able to solve one of the puzzles later on in the game, making it very replayable. Which is quite important for a game this short. And I do highly recommend giving it at least 2 playthroughs. However, there is one spot in this game that is incredibly infuriating. Without saying too much, you will be looking for a dog somewhere in town, and this location is randomized every playthrough. So here's a tip. Examine every corner of every screen to make absolutely sure he's not there, else you might be looking for him for quite a while. I know I did on my first run. The music in this game is incredibly relaxing and makes for fantastic background noise. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I used Ethan's ringtone as my own for at least a year or so. It's some damn good stuff. So in conclusion, do I recommend this game? Oh, absolutely. I mean, if anything, it makes for a nice time waster considering how short it is, and while it's still not nearly as good as Shadow of Memories, I'd still say it's at the very least worth checking out for the story alone. Cheers!